G'day. Welcome back to the Sports Medicine Project. You are here with Blake and my co-host Kelly. How you doing, Kelly?
I'm good. Only took us about 20 minutes to get to the final record this afternoon.
Yeah.
You'd think after 104 episodes we'd start to know what to do, but...
Well, I know what to do. I've never had that much trouble with it ever. You see, I usually just click the button and it starts and we're good to go. That's the most it's ever played around. But anyway, welcome to episode 104. We have a very big episode to get into. We've got a bit of housekeeping, of course. We've got this episode with Dr. Stacy Sims, which we recorded this week, but it was just full of gold. We had to get it out there. We were itching, screaming. I couldn't even sleep at night. I was thinking, get this out there to the lovely sports medicine listeners.
Yeah, I enjoyed this.
You the same?
Yeah, I wasn't the same. I really enjoyed recording this episode with Stacy, and I have listened to her speak on so many podcasts before, but it was really cool to be able to ask our own questions that have almost sort of stemmed from a lot of those podcasts that we've listened to in the past. So we were able to almost elaborate on some of that knowledge that we have learnt in the past from but all of, her books and her podcasts and her courses and all of the above. So it was really cool.
Yeah, I've read both her... I've read Raw. What was the book before that? I think
Raw was the first one. And then the second one was the menopause book.
Yeah, the menopause book is the most recent one. I've read both of those. They were great. Women's physiology is really interesting. It is really, I think just...
Men are boring.
Hey?
Men are boring.
I thought you were saying, like, men are boring instead of menopause. I was like, that's actually pretty funny, but not say that part.
No, men's physiology is boring. It's all the same. Females get to go up and down, and there's so much to learn, and there's so much that we don't know, whereas men, we just know it all. So there's nothing more that we can get from it. So
yeah, I'm gonna sit on the fence here because this topic is hard to approach. But if I was to say something about female physiology, I would be crucified. Now, not to say that
I'm only kidding. Men are interesting too.
Yeah, but imagine
females
imagine if I said that about you and this got clipped and then sent out, especially with the current polarizing climate of social media. I would be crucified as someone that hates women, I would think. Because they're like, this guy's just saying physiology is boring. But I think I do know what you mean. It's potentially not as varied over the life cycle. Is that what you mean to say?
And I think it's just exciting that there's all this new information coming out now on women that has just been hidden for so long. So it's just a space that is evolving, and we're learning new things every single day. And I think it's almost really cool to read an article that it almost says further research has to be conducted before we can draw any definitive conclusions, because it is just so new and it's exciting.
Yes, I really enjoy the part talking about Shockwave and just how you would approach potentially a female versus a male in the consult. Now, not to say that they're vastly different and we're treating very differently, but there's a couple of cool nuances which I found really interesting. Whether or not that actually changes clinical practice, well, that's up to you. But to me, there's a couple of things that I got from this podcast that I implemented the day after, and that was how quickly I may recommend someone trialing a period of shockwave therapy based off a couple of their phenotype characteristics, which is good. But housekeeping before we get into that, I did want to give a shout out to two podiatrists, both down in the worst part of the country in Adelaide. One is Michael Nishke. I just wanted to publicly thank him because a lot of the information that I learn and knowledge that I learn is actually just chatting a little bit with him. He's a really smart guy that knows a lot about podiatry, but a lot about running. And I think that I like to chat to him the most is around running load prescription and how to modify intensity versus time on feet based off different conditions like an Achilles or a forefoot. So yeah, I wanted to shout out to him. And then also to other previous friend of the show, Matt Clark, who was the
previous friend, not current friend.
Oh, sorry, previous guest. I hope he's still our friend. Previous guest, well, they're both being previous guests. But Matt Clark was the national 3K steeplechase winner down in Adelaide, which was pretty cool. And they're podiatrists, which is even cooler.
Yeah, both amazing episodes as well. They were really fun to record.
Podiatrists are getting quick. Do you think if we were to say...
And Tom DeCano as well.
Yeah, he's pretty quick too.
triple threat.
Yeah. If we were to say podiatry versus physio, you take the top 5 physio runners, top 5 podiatry runners, who would win, do you think, in a marathon? And it's just the most across the line first. I think Tom would probably come.
I mean, out of the females, Jess Stenson would come in first.
Oh, yeah,
for sure.
she's physio too. I don't know if we have any female podiatry runners that I know. Maybe Alice from Sydney? I don't know. Yeah, you got Jess. Oh, you got Ellie too. She's
and Ellie. Yeah, that's right.
I don't know who else. I don't know, but that would be pretty cool.
I think the females would win the physios the physios would win out of the females, and the podiatrists would probably win out of the males.
And the males, yeah.
Yeah, I can't think of any male. Oh, I guess Joe Ryan. Depends what distance we're running.
Nah, marathon. But he could come out and run a big one. You reckon I'd be in there? I'd sure be in there. Top 10.
Nah, I haven't to be at the bottom of the ladder in there.
Actually, my Strava, my Garmin predictor says
ran
that.
Like 7 days this week.
You know who else we would have on there? And I bet you didn't know this. Dr. Kevin Kirby. Remember?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he run like a 2:27, I think.
Wow, that's pretty quick.
He wouldn't be able to run it now, but back in the day.
Also, question to everyone out there. Talking about deload weeks, just going to throw you under the bus quickly. When we have a deload week, how significant of a deload do you think that should be?
It's not throwing me under the bus if you know I'm going to be right.
Let's run 7Ks.
I've run 14Ks this week.
And you normally run like 80.
So what's the goal? What's the goal of a deload week?
I don't think it's to
Hang on,
basically
just
stop
wait a
running.
second. Just hold the phone. What's the goal of a deload week?
Well, to refresh and recover, but I don't think you need to just put your feet up and stop running completely.
So I understand where you're coming from, but I'm going to have to throw you back under the bus after I just got away from it. So I went to the gym 5 times this week and did hopping, jumping, calf raises, strength, legs, upper, big, swole, all that kind of stuff. And I did 2 runs. But if the goal is to completely rest...
But is the goal to completely rest in a deload week?
Well, it depends on what... I think we might be arguing semantics. So...
You just wanted to have a full-on rest week.
The definition for me was to completely rest my tendons and bones from those repetitive loading cycles. So I don't really care if I lose any fitness or any skill.
A skeletal reset.
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, not really, because I was hopping and jumping, but to a degree. And less energy intensive, really just gather my thoughts, come about to start the biggest training running block that has ever been done in history, 21 weeks until Berlin sub-3 goal.
21, is it?
My goal is to take
exciting.
37 minutes and 27 seconds off my marathon time. But my last 2 marathons...
Putting it out there.
Put it out there in the public. But yes, that'll be good.
I'm keen. I am also looking forward to building to Berlin as well. I've got UTA in 2 weeks, and after that I think I'm going to have a bit of a deload, and then we're on.
Yeah, you're going to smash it. When you're going to UTA, I'll be up at the Sport and Exercise Australia Conference, which was a sellout, which I'm really looking forward to going. If you are a podiatrist and you are listening to this and you are going, please, and you have run a sub 19 5K, let me know, because I would like to run that at the Coolum Park Run Saturday morning.
Really? That's
if anyone
fun.
wants to come in and we maybe run
I don't think does Coolum have a park run?
Is it Coolum? That one?
Majimba.
Oh, Majimba, yeah. Because
Noosa would have a park run,
and Noosa as well. But I know it's flat and fast. I've said this to every podiatrist on earth. My dream, I have a couple of dreams. Number 4 dream that I have, don't have it as often, but a bunch of podiatrists that all running together, just yarning about shoes and foams and plates. I'm like, hey, what shoe do you think is best for this? That's...
While running a sub 19?
No, hell no. While running about 5:30s.
That's warm-up, cool-down chat?
No. Just on a long run. Just going out for 90 minutes.
So you're going to do a sub 19 and a long run?
Yeah, because there's multiple days up there. I just want to talk to some people about midsoles, because you don't find them that interesting. And I want to talk about heel pitch. And I want to talk about how heel pitch changes, hey?
I like that stuff. I talk about that all the time with my patients.
I don't know you're talking about midsoles.
I do. I say make sure you got a thick midsole for your...
Why is that?
For your tib post tendinopathy.
Why is that? Why do you want a thick midsole?
Oh, wide.
Do you want wide midsole? You want a wide plantar gauge. Well, people would call it definitions, but this is a little clinical trick if you are a foot and ankle managing clinician out there, if you look at the geometry of a shoe, if you look at the plantar aspect of the shoe, you will see in shoes such as the Nimbus or the Hoka, through the midfoot, it's actually going to be wider. So the geometry is going to be having more contact with the ground. And what that means is a greater surface area in contact with the ground and potentially more stability. And you'll have some potential flares off through there. And that's going to create more, hopefully, even force if you walk on even ground up under the foot. And that may help reduce some of the external workload that the muscles have to do, which is pretty cool to look at. So if you say thick midsole, well, someone could then
no,
go...
I didn't mean thick, I meant wide.
Yeah, wide and relatively thick too, because what a thick midsole will do is actually make the shoe stiffer because there's more surface area. So if you have someone with a, say, a forefoot complaint and they're very irritable when they push off and they're extending their toes, if you have a thicker midsole in combination with a rockwood midsole, that is actually going to provide more external stiffness. So then the foot doesn't have to have as much internal force to the structures that are sore. Pretty
just
good,
like
eh?
a walking encyclopedia, aren't you?
You know why I can say that so consistently without a pause or an I say it so often.
I was talking to Joe about this the other day. I was saying, do you ever feel like you sound a little bit robotic because you've said the same thing so many times?
A little bit, but you can put your own little bit of spin and salt and pepper on it, because you can say it and pause and come back to it. I don't know, maybe. I mean, I feel as though, like, I did a consultation yesterday, which was awesome. I know this person listens to our podcast as well. I did a podcast with someone overseas. Podcast. I definitely didn't do a podcast. I did an online consultation with someone from overseas that has bilateral, multiple different location stress fractures, and they're recovering. And we just talked about some loading programs and to return to running, and we're going to continue to see each other over the next several months. And I find if I see and talk clinically day in, day out, I sound a lot more fluid when I'm talking, and I don't sound as robotic, but maybe I do.
I think it's when I am on a good roll like
Yeah,
that I tend to...
Multiple days in a row?
That I tend to sound most robotic.
I don't know if it's that robotic. I think you sound fluid.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I feel in myself like I've said the same thing a few times too many.
Fuck, how good is
Because
this?
sometimes I'm like, I wonder if they know that I say this all the time.
Nah, because it's new and it's a new experience and the context is different and you might be different and you might be in the gym and you might be touching their foot when you say it. So things are different. See, I had a consult yesterday. I don't feel like I've stopped work this week, and I feel as though I need to speak about anything to anyone who will listen, and we've got an open mic here. This could turn into a 4-hour Joe Rogan style. Yeah, stop yapping, you idiot. So, housekeeping, we are speaking with Dr. Stacy Sims, who we will introduce further into the episode. But if you are wanting to, go into our show notes and you'll see a little link there called Patreon if you want to support the show, keep the lights on. And if you want to become a better clinician, I think it's worth signing up for. And I toyed with that term for the last couple of weeks. I thought, is it really presumptuous to think that I'm going to create something that's going to make you a better clinician? And then I really thought about it. And because of some of the content on there is me evaluating research and going through papers, if you don't have the time to go through research or you don't have access to the papers, which these are all open access papers anyway, I think it's going to be better than not doing that. So it's worth a oat cappuccino hot $6.50 a month if you think it's worthwhile. And we put up a research review every fortnight, plus we put up video content as well. So our last one was a combination of early acute and later stage perineal progression, and I think they were about 15 to 25 minutes each video, and then also some audio if you want to be able to listen to it. And that will link up to your podcast, so you can actually listen to it like you listen to this episode, which will be pretty cool. So I think if you, otherwise the other tier is if you just want to support us, you can.
How good.
Yeah.
Why not?
How bloody good. So we got some great feedback, which was really awesome. I love when we get feedback into the podcast through our social media. People saying they really enjoyed Kelly and I discussing and going through our week and that different format. So we're going to continue to do that. But we're also going to add in another segment. We're going to go doso today.
What's that? You haven't warned me on this.
I haven't. You can add to it if you would like. I didn't want to put any pressure on you. As you would know, and as you tell me quite a lot, sometimes I can be a bit glued to the medium screen. If I'm reading a paper or I'm trying to speak to you about something cool, or it's a Saturday morning and we're driving a park run and I've got Keith Barr playing in the car, you're like, can you turn this crap off? I don't want to really listen to work stuff. So, and last night, actually, I was watching these really cool lectures on inflammation in tendons as I was going to bed, and it was just interesting. I just really loving learning at the moment. So I thought I'd add in this segment about just the research reading that I found this week, and then I had enough of a chance to actually read the paper and go through it rather than just skim through it in 20 minutes. So a couple of papers two papers that I read, plus one interesting video that I watched. So the research one was all looking at building bone mineral density in people who are already running.
So is this a YouTube video?
These are two papers.
Oh, papers.
So, the big question, I guess, is can runners who are at a high risk of suffering a bone stress injury, can they continue to build bone mineral density while they're running? And the research would suggest that they can. There's not too many papers, but in one study, they took collegiate female athletes, 2 groups. One group did 5x5 squats and deadlifts at 60 to 85% of their 1RM for 16 weeks. And they showed greater bone mineral density just in the femur. Sorry, they showed greater bone mineral density overall, so total BMD, but their femur was exactly the same. Do you think that's funny?
It is funny, hey.
Why do you think that would be?
Well, you mentioned this to me yesterday, I think, and I just wonder if it has something to do with the metabolic activity of the femur, and if the runners are running at quite a high volume, if that has anything to do with it.
Yeah.
I don't know why it would be more localized to the femur, but if it is maybe more metabolically driven, or maybe because it makes sense. The running loads maybe aren't as high in the femur opposed to like the plantar flexor loads. But then you would think they would be higher in the squats and the deadlifts.
Yeah, it was interesting. I really like that idea of, the more proximal parts are going to be more metabolically active because there's a higher percentage of trabecular bone. And if running is more energy intensive, maybe that's going to be affecting
However, did you say that in the control group it was the same?
It was the same. So it wasn't worse, it was the same. But total BMD was up. So I think they measured lumbar spine, femur, and total BMD.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hey,
yeah, but
did they comment on that at all in the paper?
They did, and they spoke about it again because they also did blood serum levels and looked at I can't remember the 2 bone biomarkers that they measured, but it's hard to speak about that because I don't understand the hormones and bone biomarkers yet that well, but I'm endeavouring to try and learn about them.
Cool.
But I thought that was cool, but only 5x5, and that was twice a week. So 25 reps, but not that much, hey, 5x5. Like you could easily...
Makes me feel better about my gym sessions, I have to say.
Yeah, and 16 weeks I would say that's like 4 months is too short. I would say it needs to be at least...
I think 16 weeks is a reasonable time frame. I think that's longer than most strength programs that you'd see. Well,
bone remodeling 6 to 9 months. Like the Lift More trial, they did 8 months because they said 6 is bone remodeling plus we wanted to add 2 more.
Yeah.
So, still great. The other study was... I thought this was cool.
Sorry.
No, you're right. Other study which I thought was interesting was looking at the same principles but in males, and they were looking at people that run and did strength training, people that just did strength training, and then healthy controls matched to them. And they did some cool things. They measured their bone mineral density, but they also measured free testosterone and maybe isolated. I definitely remember the free. There was another one on there as well. But why? What? I did that so I could see where it is on the thing. Did you think I was really saying that then?
I don't know. It's just funny.
Yeah, so what do you think what group do you think had the highest BMD and also highest level of testosterone?
I wasn't listening, sorry.
That's all right. You don't have to listen to me. That's why we've got the podcast. So, out of a group where you've got a group running doing strength training, just males, and then matched healthy controls. One not running and them doing resistance training.
Strength training.
That's what you think?
Yeah.
It's strength training and running.
And running. Yeah.
So strength training and running, greater BMD, greater testosterone, which was pretty cool. And I was speaking to someone on socials after I shared the study, and they were saying they just feel better when they're resistance train. And I'm the same. I really do just feel like I don't know what it is. I just feel, the only way I can describe it is I feel more like a caveman when I lift. That's how I imagine they felt. Just strong and just eating meat, getting lifting, getting lean.
That testosterone surge.
Yeah. That's what I feel when I lift. I really do notice it. I don't know if it's placebo, but I really, really do. If I just run, I feel a bit weak. Whereas if I just lift something and get a pump, you just don't get a pump when you run, or maybe I don't run hard enough. But you get a bicep pump, there's not much you can't do in life compared to if you run a hard 200. You're like, that's pretty cool. But they're both great.
I do like the feeling of lifting weights, but I think I'm just not very good at it.
Yeah, well, it's all relative.
Yeah. Although, after listening to this podcast that you're about to listen to, I have I'm like way more motivated to get into the gym and do more weights and go down to the oval and do some sprints.
Yeah, you'll smash that.
That's what I need to do.
Yeah, you'll get that, what's the equivalent? Estrogen, progesterone, you'll get that pumping up.
That surge.
The other one that I watched was the Ebony Rio talk on cortical inhibition, and I will try to endeavour to explain it as well as she did, but what she talks about is in tendinopathy, we potentially may have something called cortical inhibition, where she describes it like the brain almost has a brake on when you're trying to maximally contract the muscle and the tendon. So if you've had tendinopathy for a long time, you have these changes in the brain, and she describes it like a brake. So the idea of using a metronome is to try to get you to concentrate on that and go through a range of beep, 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 and that's meant to almost take off the brake and get that motor recruitment restored, which was really interesting. Is that how you've learned it? Because I know you would have been well aware of this before I was.
I have used a metronome in tendinopathy rehab.
Yeah.
And I have used it from a perspective of trying to harness that neuromuscular...
corticospinal control.
Yeah, or connection or something like that. And I would tend to use it more in the early stage of rehab, because my understanding is that the nervous system changes are the changes that happen sort of earlier on in tendinopathy rehab. So I would use that earlier in the piece. And also I think it works out quite well when you're trying to cue someone for like heavy, slow resistance training. It's a good marker to keep things moving slowly. So yeah, that's how I've used it in the past.
Yeah.
I think it's something that you can mention. Whether people do it or not, I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard with setup and things, and you don't want to... I thought it's going to create a big barrier, but it almost is another barrier. Like,
it's another...
fuck,
just have to do this other thing. Yeah.
Beep, beep, beep. And then if you stop talking, it's still going beep. Anyway.
Yeah.
Let's get into our clinical week. How about you go first, lovely co-host?
My Monday... this week on Monday, had 17 patients back to back, and I killed it. That was my day where I felt a little bit robotic by the end of the day, and I did feel as though I'd said the same thing quite a few times. And that was okay though, because I just was onto it. I was very structured with my plan that I wanted to do with each patient, because I didn't want to run late, and I was also very conscious of trying to get my notes done as much as possible during the 30-minute time slot. And I just got to the end of the day, and I had felt like I'd accomplished so much, and it was a really good day. It also helped that those patients, all 17 of them, were amazing. 17 my favorite patients ever, and yeah, it was just a really great day, and I enjoyed it. And it's kind of one of those ones where you go into it and you feel a little bit daunted, because it's like, oh, this is going to be a big day. But it was just a good day.
Yeah, once you get in that rhythm, you can flow quite well. And they were all reviews, or?
Yeah, they're all follow-ups.
Yeah, you don't have to get up as much, because you've got a bit of a plan in place. And I love this, I'm always going to butcher it, but I love this one that...
You work at a butcher?
I'm going to butcher this. This saying, when someone comes in, Justin come up with it, the 3 R's, but I can remember 2. Like if someone comes in with a plan, you're either reviewing it, seeing how it went, you're either, I've stuffed it. It's like you're either going to continue with it, you're either going to change it, or you're going to talk about it more. Are the 3 things that basically you do every time you come back for initial. He'll have to come on and explain it. We've been meaning to do a podcast for the last 9 years, but he never comes on. Got to get him on.
Busy man with 2 babies.
Yeah.
How was your Monday?
Mine was alright, but you go Tuesday.
No, I reckon Monday to Monday.
No, because we keep
just the whole thing?
keep with the flow. Keep with the flow.
Gotcha. Tuesday, I had a patient, and it was just interesting how different people have different perceptions of pain and injury and the severity of it and their concern around it. So this patient came in and they had returned to sport after having a number of years off sport, and in the first half of the game they started to notice a bit of discomfort in their hamstring is what they reported. Went to take off for a sprint and it got a little bit worse, and
classical presentation.
They continued to play despite the fact that it was very painful, and then later that evening noticed that it was quite debilitating, and I'd seen them a couple of days later, and their approach to it was just quite fascinating. They were like, I just wanted to make sure I'm cool to play this weekend, or see, if it's going to result in me having to skip training today or on Thursday. And then looking at their hamstring, it was black. Like their whole hamstring was just black and purple and very injured. And it was, like obviously a pretty nasty hamstring strain is what the diagnosis of that one was. But more so the thing that was fascinating was the level of concern around it, because you could imagine the same injury on a different person coming in, and it would be a very different sort of conversation or concern that they had around it, and expectation around what was going to be required to manage it.
It's like the 2 different archetypes of an endurer versus a non-endurer.
Yeah,
where you
an
need to be
or a avoider.
Avoider, endurer and avoider, where you do need to be almost extra cautious with them, because if something like that's happened, like I'll be alright, and they can just continue to end up in this vicious cycle.
For sure.
Do people have a better prognosis if they have a tear or they have a strain and they can keep playing? Is that generally a better sign?
A tear and a strain is the same thing.
Yeah, you never actually really, because a strain is like you're pulling it apart, but the muscle always tears.
Yeah, I think I call it a strain to patients because it sounds a little bit less threatening.
Yeah, all the grading.
Particularly when it's like a lower level one, but then when it's something a little bit more severe, or for this patient, for example, who maybe was underestimating the severity of it, in that scenario, I was calling it a tear, because I think they needed to realise that it was probably something that they needed to action.
Go for, yeah. And then Wednesday. Wicked Wednesday.
Oh, this week, it wasn't just on Wednesday, it was actually Monday and Wednesday. 2 patients, actually I had another one too, 3 long-term Achilles tendinopathy patients back to their sport this week, and I was just so stoked for them, and they were stoked, and we were just all happy, and it was just a good time. It's a good
pain?
feeling. One of them without pain, 2 of them with pain. Yeah.
And they were happy with that, understood that.
One of them had been sort of on the return for quite some time. I followed up with them, so that was 3 months later, and so they're pretty well pain-free now. The other 2 are still running or still training through or back to their sport, I suppose, with pain and a bit of discomfort, but it's really stable and they know how to manage it, and they're progressing each week, which is really cool. What
do you think when someone has returned to their activity? Do you think it's a smart idea to have follow-ups months into the future? In my opinion, it is, because there's always the risk if it plateaus, or there's usually still more work to do, because getting back to sport, starting sport isn't usually the goal. It's getting back and feeling confident and having that, ability to be able to play and things not spiral out of control. So you usually do a couple of months after, or how would you do it? Depends, I guess, what stage they are.
I think, and sort of when it's in that sort of middle stage, like maybe monthly follow-ups is appropriate. And then towards that later stage, maybe push it out to 2 months and then 3 months, and then discharge if they're feeling okay, or maybe another 3 months. I leave it up to them though as well. Like if they've got performance goals, or if they want to keep progressing something and they're not sure how to go about it, then we can talk about that.
Yeah, and
I often find they get quite excited though when they come in. They're like, "Oh, I just want to tell you about all these things that I'm achieving now, which I wasn't before," and it's quite fun.
Yeah, yes, that would filter then through, letting them decide will filter through their personality and what they are. Like you say, as an easy example, the endurer versus the coper. For someone that hasn't been able to play for a year, you might send them a little bit sooner to talk through confidence and progressing them back again, whereas the other person you might go a little bit later.
Well, I think the endurer, you'd probably push them back a bit later, do you think?
Yeah, again, this is generally speaking, maybe their personality type. So someone that's really fearful and they're just getting back, you want to see how they responded to it and talk about them so they've got that extra support and I guess facilitation. Yeah. I thought about it because I had someone this week, not to steal your week, but I had someone this week who had actually gotten back to sport and didn't have a follow-up with somebody else. And then they actually come to see me. And they were basically fine, but they'd had a flare-up and kind of didn't know what to do. That, for me, in my mind, I'm like, that doesn't happen every time. But I know the other person, everything was fine. They were still continuing their rehab, but just that follow-up probably would have maybe avoided that.
Yeah, for sure.
Thursday.
I just came down with this weird sickness during my last patient of the day. I just got really cold and was headachy and felt really off, and it was an initial consult and I felt terrible because I just was not all there. I just felt all over the shop and I just could not focus my attention to them because I was like literally shaking, like wanted to put all my jumpers on and turn the heaters on, and felt vacant. I felt really bad. I was like, in my head, I was like, I just need to make up for this next time. So I booked them in quite early. So early-ish next week, I think I'm seeing them. And I just want to try and make up for it and do a better job next time because I just felt quite, not 100% there. And I like to try and put 100% into everything with every patient. And I couldn't because I was just not well. And what would you do in that scenario?
Yeah, you persevere. I remember an old boss saying one of the hallmarks of a good clinician is how well you can go on autopilot and do a good job when you're having a bad day or when you're not well. But isn't it funny how you feel like that, although you are human, and most people would understand? Like if I have woken up tired or sick, so there isn't a quote at all, but I haven't had a sick day in 2.5 years just because I've generally felt not sick enough to not go to work. But there are times where I probably maybe could have, but I'm like, it's just going to be to move a whole list 2 weeks in advance. It's just too much effort. And by the time I get there, I'm actually usually fine.
I think if I'm feeling quite sick or run down, I would preference taking a sick day because, as I said, I'd rather feel like I can give the patient everything rather than feel like I'm lacking in energy or I'm more focused on the fact that I'm not feeling well. Yeah,
and you were really sick. Like, I haven't been that sick before where you're really struggling. The worst is whenever you've got congestion. That's the only time where it really frustrates me because I'm trying to speak to someone and I either have to cough, like I'm like, oh, sorry, or I'm blowing my nose, or that's the
no,
worst.
You know what the worst would be?
Losing your leg and going to work.
Being pregnant in your first trimester and having morning sickness and having to like run out and throw up between every patient or during patients. That would be the worst.
That would be the worst.
I remember one of our old bosses up on the sunny coast being pregnant and having really bad morning sickness, and I remember her like running across the hallway into the bathroom regularly during consults. That's
dedication. That's what you have to do when you're a business owner. You can't give up. Yeah. So I'll jump into my week then, because you only do a 4-day week.
I only do a 4-day week now, Monday to Thursday.
So Monday afternoon. So I teach at the university Monday mornings, but in the afternoon I usually have 6 people back to back who are usually follow-ups. But long-term cases who I'm slowly building a list with of people with midfoot osteoarthritis, and it's usually a little bit more diffuse. Some of the most common joints, the kind of lateral border, calcaneocuboid, tendinonavicular, sometimes TMT. I guess it kind of can be everywhere, and the ankle joint. And it's very difficult because the surgery options are just not as clear, and we don't have as good research to say that they're really good for the knee and for the hip. And we've had Dr. Ken, a previous guest, is an orthopedic surgeon, speak about this, but the surgical options just aren't that good. And the biomechanics involved is quite unique, where if I'm replacing the knee or the hip, I've got a pretty good idea as to how they both work, and it is one joint. When it comes to the foot and the midfoot, you're dealing with a really small isolated joint with multiple joints around there, with lots of force in through there.
That is tough.
So it's difficult, explaining and talking with these people that, it is sore and it presents very much like other osteoarthritic cases. But the research, and there's a great systematic review that came out to suggest what the first line research should be, which would be corticosteroid injections, which generally don't have the greatest long-term benefit. Carbon plates of varying degrees, 0.5 to 1.5 mil, and that's to make the shoe really stiff so the midfoot doesn't have to have as much force in through it. And then foot orthoses. And these I find are the cases where a custom foot orthotic will actually usually be more appropriate. Not all the time, of course, but something that's able to generate enough stiffness in through the middle part. So if you're a clinician out there and you've got someone, struggling with that, they can really benefit from that and some good shoes. Now, it's certainly not the panacea, and it certainly doesn't take all their discomfort away, but it can work quite well. And if you know how to modify them and change them, if somebody feels they're a bit too much, you can always adjust it and make it less, but they're just very, very difficult to manage. Because of the foot and the pressures in through there. You guys got
a wide midsole.
They do need a wide plantar midsole. You are right. But yeah, just difficult to manage. The foot is difficult because, and I explain this to people, patients, that is, it's a very unique combination of joints. Just like your hand. Like, where else in the body do you have something like that other than the hand? You just don't. Everywhere else is a piece of cake. Knees, one joint. Foot, lots. Like 32, I think it is, maybe. There's lots of joints in there. Anyway, podiatrists are really smart. Tuesday, a unique case of just a lower limb tendonitis, acutely sore down the inside of the ankle. And it's not challenging to differentiate between like an FHL tendinopathy and potentially a tibialis posterior tendinopathy, but usually FHL is a bit sorer distally and on top of the arch. But acutely sore and was too sore to do any high level loading. We just did some inversion and some big toe flexion at the start. There was just about 30 minutes into the initial consultation, and after it felt immensely better. Just with some movement. Isn't it incredible how obviously nothing changed from within the tendon, but I guess you could argue potentially things did change, but to improve that quickly.
How common is FHL tendinopathy? Is that something you see a lot of or not?
Well, I do see some feet day to day. I probably see it more than most. I think so. I mean, it's usually diagnosed as a plantar fasciitis or plantar fasciopathy, and the telltale sign is obviously pain, usually down on when they flex with their big toe, and I'll get them to, they'll be 90 degrees, I'll push against their big toe, and I'll say, I want you to plantar flex and push your big toe down at the same time, and usually that's a bit easier for them to push their big toe. But the one that really gets it is the discomfort. It's just on where you imagine the arch to be, just a little bit higher, and then it kind of dips under to the big toe. Mm-hmm. That's how you can really tell. And usually they may be more of a tenosynovitis, so they don't follow the typical tendon signs. But I do see it quite a bit. Cool. So that's interesting. Wednesday, Richie brace, just an awesome response. Someone that's really struggled with getting around, not a candidate for surgery, and just had such a great response to the brace. Like, can do so much more. Walking, pains somewhat. It is better, but still some low-grade ache because there's some osteoarthritic changing through the foot. But it just speaks to just how great braces can be. Like, braces and supports and shoes can really make such a difference for people.
Big quality of life improvement.
Yeah. Then on Thursday, the plantar fasciitis. No, plantar heel pain, very, very common in our clinic. But the question of when to load and when not to load, irritability, compliance, what other things they do throughout the day. The study that was done, I think it was in 2014. I always forget to pronounce his name. The Roth et al. One where they got a group doing calf raises with the toe bent up in the air to put more strain on the plantar fascia. That's kind of the only study that I've seen that's tried to really talk about differing plantar fascia load. Are you aware of any papers that have tried to quantify load on the plantar fascia?
No.
Because I find
I
a lot of...
think you were talking to me about this recently. You were trying to look at something like that. But
Yeah.
other than that, I hadn't really thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it. You can use something like the fasciitis finder. You can use a towel. You can use a little bit of felt. You can really use anything to put more load on the toe. Yeah.
Essentially is all you're doing. You're stretching it more.
Yeah, so putting it more in stretch and going through a calf raise. But I find that people can do it quite easily. Like, I'll have people relatively early up on a towel off a step doing it on a single leg and it feels okay. And I wonder if it's really just some form of movement, again, that's relatively challenging. It doesn't matter too much of the exercise. But from what we see in the research, what seems to be a really good foot loader is doing plyometrics. So I wonder if you could, in combination with that, and potentially that's making or having more of an effect, is just doing some really low level hopping and jumping, and that's loading all the foot muscles rather than doing this real isolated kind of foot and ankle stuff. Because this person really did struggle to lift up their toes up and down, but I don't really know what that is that great.
I think as soon as someone can calf raise, intrinsic foot strengthening becomes redundant, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I still do like the short foot, and I do some. I guess the difference in foot and ankle versus just the foot. Like, I don't know what having control of not being able to lift your toes up and spread them. Do you think that is relevant? Like, does someone need to have that restored? Is that a deficit? I guess is what I'm asking.
No, I guess it depends on their
what they want to do. Yeah. But it's something for the general person. General person comes in asymptomatic.
No, I don't think you need to know how to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it can be good in the early stage, just movement. Almost as like that cortical inhibition like Ebony was talking about. It's just something that really requires like maximal concentration from your nervous system to be able to coordinate, or that neuromuscular system to be able to coordinate those movements.
Yeah.
But as I said, I think as soon as someone can calf raise, I see more value in that.
Yeah, and you're obviously using the muscles and the joint in that way if you're doing a calf raise. Thursday, I was a little bit annoyed. Let's get your opinion on this. I was listening to another podcast.
I think you already said Thursday.
Did I? Yeah, I did. Sorry, Friday it was. It was Friday. Listening to another podcast. And this person on this podcast was speaking about podiatry. And this person works in a footwear store. And I'm assuming the best in the person, good faith always. They said... Yeah, I think a good conversion for a sports podiatrist, they prescribe orthoses about 1 or twice out of 5 people. I thought, that's interesting. Because obviously you would see people that have seen a podiatrist go into a footwear store. And I thought, so you think a good conversion rate for someone that's coming in, you have no context of their injury or the training to understand what the injury is and the impact on their life, it is good for a person to prescribe 1 out of every 5 to come in.
How many do you think you would?
It doesn't matter because it
depends on the person.
Yeah, it's nothing to do with like you could say
you're not going to be like, oh, you're my first out of the next 5 patients, so orthotic time for you.
Yeah, and the thing that I think was...
I guess where that comes from though is, like I even remember Dr. Kemp talking about this. He was saying that his conversion rate for a consult to then go on to surgery was like 10% or something like that. So I think that is like a number that is commonly or talked about, or a metric that people often refer to. So I don't know. Yeah,
but you don't understand the other side to it though. So the other example would be, if I see someone that's been to the footwear store, if I see 5 people and they come into me and they go, what the hell, you've all got Brooks Ghost on. A good, no. For a footwear retailer, it should be 1 in 5 you should have Brooks Ghost. It sounds... just odd. And
it also depends on what type of podiatry practice someone's working in. Like if you're predominantly seeing musculoskeletal conditions versus a podiatrist who's seeing majority general treatment, is that what it's called?
Yeah, I guess so.
That would probably change it as well.
Yeah. Well, I just think you're going to have negative connotations if you're already thinking in your mind, if I see 2 people today and they have authorities that this podiatrist is an overprescriber, where purely based off anything, those two people could really need that, or they could want that. Or
yeah, like you could have a day where you prescribe an orthotic 10 times, and then you could have a day where you don't prescribe an orthotic at all, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and theoretically, I mean, you could argue that anyone with a foot and ankle, if you think that they're going to benefit for having less load on that area, you could in principle say that, well, everybody could benefit from a foot orthosis. That, again, not to say everybody does need one, nor do we describe like that, but it's very hard to have those thoughts and feelings already without actually knowing that person, their fears, their pain, or the clinician, or what they spoke about. Because I would never say that about any other practitioner.
What about a custom?
Again, you just...
Depends.
Yeah, it really does depend. And you don't want... Because if, let's say that person was to come in and say, man, they've got Brooks Ghost on, and I'm like, oh, another Brooks Ghost? Oh, that person. I might say something to the patient. Like, oh, no, you don't need the Brooks Ghost. And it's like, well, they were in the store with the retailer. I trust them. The person probably tried it on. They tried some other ones on. Maybe they like the colour, the size. There's just all these things I don't know, and I have to make lots of assumptions. So I thought that was just odd. And
Did they say it in a malicious way?
No, of course not. No. I just thought, when in passing, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I thought on that Friday, because it wasn't really clinical, is with recurring stress reaction and stress fractures, is it worth resistance training in the long term and continued long term to create good, healthy bone adaptation and higher resiliency to bone long after discomfort is gone? So if you have a stress fracture or stress reaction come into your clinic and you do all the recovery and the rehab and they get back to everything as normal, should all those people do continued osteogenic bone building exercises? Because we know the risk factors are going to be involved within there.
Yeah, I think so.
Are you getting people to do that? Are you explaining that?
Try to. Yeah. Sometimes people get to their stage where they're back doing their sport and they're done. Like they don't really want to see any further. Yeah. But I'll always educate them on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we play a pretty good role in that. It's a bit like, I thought about it a lot as I was going to bed, because you could say that about the things that we know are good for people. So on the same side, people that we see, should we be trying to advocate for them meeting physical activity guidelines? Because we know that's going to be almost, good for everyone if they're not meeting that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but that's hard to make that change. But it doesn't mean we can't advocate for it. Because if you say 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 people may get on board with that, that's an awesome change that you've been able to make.
Yeah.
But it's that challenge of showing them.
Yeah, it's stepping outside of the regular care and making it better.
Great.
High quality.
Okay, so today we are speaking with Dr. Stacy Sims, who is an internationally recognised exercise physiologist and nutrition scientist. She currently holds a PhD and serves as the Senior Researcher Associate at SPR INZ AUT University, where she's supervising PhD students and advising cutting-edge companies. Her research focuses on female athlete health and performance, challenging existing dogma and improving research on women. She's done multiple TED Talks and authored many books, one of the most popular being Raw, which explores sex differences in training and nutrition across the lifespan. She runs her own business, providing online learning material focused on women's training with their physiology across the lifespan. And she has been published over 70 peer-reviewed papers and is a sought-after speaker at the professional and academic conferences. She has been named one of the top 50 visionaries of the running industry and one of the top 40 women changing the paradigm of her field by Outside magazine. Now, in the episode, we talk about basically everything you could ever want to speak about. No, but we get pretty close into there. So we're over an hour speaking about physiology, talking about Shockwave, talking about resistance training prescription and how that may differ between males and females. We've spoken time and time again about the menstrual cycle. So we don't touch too much on the basics of that, but we talk about what that means as we get older and how that affects us as clinicians, how to speak about it, how to talk about it. And one of the most interesting things was talking on a cellular and physiological level, the changes that we see happen throughout our body and what that means for us as clinicians for soft tissue injuries like plantar heel pain and frozen shoulder. And there's this awesome part that goes for about 10 minutes in there. We're talking about why plantar heel pain is most likely to be in the typical archetype of a female over the age of 45, and what happens to our tissues and how and why they become less resistant to tensile forces. So lots of clinical pearls in there, lots of really good clinical information which you are all going to enjoy, and we'll speak to you all next week.
Welcome back to the Sports Medicine Project. We have a very exciting guest today. We were just saying off air, someone that Blake and I have been following for many, many, many years now. So it feels a little bit surreal to be interviewing Dr. Stacy Sims. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's actually exciting because I finally know someone in time zones.
Completely. So tell us a little bit about, how you got yourself to where you are now.
It hasn't been a directive path. Like if someone said, "What was your 5-year plan?" I never have a 5-year plan. It was more answering questions and opportunities that came up. So I got into a mindset that I never wanted to push an opportunity aside because it seemed too scary or it seemed too much of too much hard work to push against anything. So when I was a university student and was studying exercise physiology and kinesiology, and we're learning all these things, and I'm an athlete, and it just didn't make sense. Poking the bear, kind of asking questions why and not getting adequate responses, doing some digging, trying to find the literature, not finding any representation of women in any of the spaces. And so that was a little bit off-putting as an athlete and someone who was trying to understand more of the actual exercise physiology and metabolism aspects of what was going on in the body, that I couldn't actually find anything that represented me or any of my friends or teammates. So that was kind of like a mark in the sand to say, I have to go after this. And so that kind of, like I've treaded on a lot of toes over the years. I've been told many times that I'm a woman with a PhD that thinks too much, that I should just, study men. We don't know enough about men. Why do we want to study women? And it's like, well, wait, I have a mom, I have a grandmother, I have a sister, I have friends, I have myself, and we want these answers for ourselves. We don't want to just be generalized from a male rat or from a male model of 18 to 22-year-olds. So that's kind of been the precedence to push forward to get to kind of where I am now.
Why do you think it was the case? What's been coming up in the research and your experience? Why it was just generalized to males, and a lot of the research was just done in this specific population, and then the recommendations were based off that?
It's a historical perspective. I mean, if we look at the history really of how modern medicine came to be in research, it all started with who was in the room. Because it used to be the women were the caregivers and the healers and the medicine people, right? And then when we started seeing more of a revolution and more modernization of what is education and what is science, women were excluded because they were thought to be delicate flowers. They weren't smart enough. They had smaller brains. I blame Darwin for starting that. So that's the one point against him. But it came to a point where the men were in a societal aspect better than women. And so they created the universities, they created the scientific design. And of course, they were testing on themselves. And so when we start looking at how scientific methodology came to be, it was based on, again, who was in the room and the male model. So it never really occurred as we started getting further and further down the track away from those early times of modern medicine, that maybe we should be looking at women from a different lens. Maybe we should be looking at women more than just a reproductive scope and what problems happen from an OB perspective. maybe we should be including them because now we're starting to see all these other outcomes as they're getting more and more involved in activity and in sport. But then again, you have that other occurrence of sport in itself is masculine and gendered. So women weren't really encompassed into sport if they had any kind of fallibility. So you start seeing women coming into sport, and if they lost their periods, well, that made them more like men. So we wouldn't say anything about it because all of a sudden that fallibility was gone. But as we start unpacking it and looking at that historical perspective, we can see from the angles of that historical perspective of why women have been excluded from research and why we've just been using male rats and not necessarily looking at female rats, and how all of those things kind of evolve to just generalizing to women.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see on social media at the moment where, there are some great pages promoting, female research. There's grants, it's awesome. And then you see these comments where people are saying, oh, we're focusing too much on this now. We need to go back to males. That just the pendulum just swings incredibly to the left and the right so much, but it is great to see. What reasons are there, I guess, to say why we can't just base what we know about males and that kind of cohort of research and generalize that to females? Like, why can't we generalize it?
Think about it from in utero, there are sex differences. We see
Mm.
different responses that the fetus has to maternal stress and how that feeds forward to DNA and gene expression. And then after birth, we see sex differences inherently through early childhood, but then we have the onset of puberty, right? So then we're seeing the expression of our sex hormones and how that creates other epigenetic responses where testosterone will increase bone strength, the bone length. We see it increases muscle mass. We have the muscle morphology differences where men and boys have more type 2 fast twitch glycolytic fibers, less of the oxidative. Where women, when we have the epigenetic exposure of estrogen and progesterone, we change our center of gravity. We have changes in our biomechanics. We end up expressing more of our type 2Bs as oxidative instead of glycolytic. So we start seeing all these sex differences that really become apparent at the onset of puberty. So as we're looking at things like metabolic dysfunction, we have to look at muscle morphology, right? So if we're looking at lactate production and lactate production for brain health, men have an advantage there because they have more glycolytic fibers. Women don't have an advantage because they tend to be in more of that long, slow, being directed less into the weight room, more into functional strength. So we start seeing that societal influences on the types of activities that women do will also downgrade some of their muscle fiber morphology, which then impacts brain health because we're not producing much lactate. We don't have the glial cells using it. So we're starting to see different neural shifts as well. And then that leads forward to things like Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's development, where we're seeing that it's a societal impact on sex differences that's creating an expression of sex differences within the medical field. And we really need to take ownership of that and say, okay, where do we start? So we have to do the research, not only from the physiological, but also the sociocultural to see how, jobs and things might be influencing brain health and risk factors for disease and metabolic dysfunction. So yeah, that's a nutshell for you.
I recently went to the Women's in Sport Congress, and there was a big topic there talking about sex differences versus gender differences, which is what you just mentioned. So those sociocultural influences that are sort of amplifying the sex change, like the sex differences between a female and a male. What do you like? Let's fast forward, say to 20 years, where, or maybe it will take longer, maybe 50 years, and all of those sociocultural things have changed. Could you see there being a smaller difference between the expressed differences between males and females?
In what regard? Like sports performance?
Yeah, like muscle size and performance and I guess ACL incidents and those sorts of things.
I don't think that by addressing all the sociocultural aspects, we're going to eliminate the sex differences. What we will see is, like, my hope is that as we start to eliminate that and we start to bring the research bias away from being male focused, and we're having an elimination of male bias in the research, that we start to see scientific studies and methodologies that are appropriate for female physiology and bone structure, and we have appropriate methodology and scientific design for the male physiology and the male bone structure. So as we start eliminating those biases and understanding sex differences versus the sociocultural gender differences, that we're going to have better research, which will lead to better outcomes to help bring women up to where men are now with regards to sports performance, not bringing men down, but bringing women up, and then promoting both to improve performance in both of the sexes. But then we also have that whole interconnection of, are we talking specifically sex differences from an XXXY, but then how do we encompass the sociocultural aspect of things like transgender? What do we look at with XXY and all the other intersects there? So as we're moving forward in research, we have to be very aware of the history and historical perspective that we've come from, and not be afraid to include that which people perceive is not the norm. So we have to include those outliers as well. So we have really clear methodology for cis women, really clear methodology for cis men. And then we have to have very clear methodology to go after this whole intersect of what is transgendered and how does that impact on how we are looking at sport, how we're looking at activity, what are our recommendations, because we can't just keep these binary aspects, right? So, I mean, there's so many different things that have to come in that might even take longer than 50 years. I hope not, but it might.
Can you give us an example of something that you have seen change in the last 5 to 10 years? Just speaking about what you just said, where we've made this broad recommendation for males and females together, and now are realizing that they basically need different advice and different education.
Well, one of the big things is relative energy deficiency in sport, right? So first we started off with the female athlete triad, and then realized it was bigger than that. And now we're including men in that design because we know that relative energy deficiency in sport affects the male body as well. When we start looking at training methodologies, looking more and more at muscle morphology, we're realizing that women are more endurance and fatigue resistant. So in order to get better adaptation and better strength gains, we have to modify the kind of training that we're doing. So higher volume, less duration. And we're starting to see that come out as better means of injury prevention and a better means of keeping women from being in that overtrained, overstressed state. So there are little things that are being implemented just in the past 4 or 5 years that's starting to make a big difference. I think the biggest thing that's happened in the past 4 or 5 years is this general conversation around menstrual cycle and oral contraceptive pills. First, we saw the pendulum on one side where we have to modify everything according to the menstrual cycle. And now we're having the big voice of the menstrual cycle doesn't matter, but actually it's in the middle. This is where we have to understand all the different hormone profiles and how a woman perceives what's happening across the menstrual cycle, because then we can use that to improve training for her and prevent injury and see what kind of performance differences we can get with existing methodologies as the research moves forward.
Yeah, that's something that I'm interested to pick your brain on a little bit further, Stacy. I actually did your course probably 2 or maybe 3 years ago now. And I think at that time it was when there was like that big surge in a lot of people saying this is how you have to train at different phases of your menstrual cycle. And then now I'm seeing things on social media, and people are saying that it's almost like nocibic and not helpful for women to be told that they should be training at a certain way during different phases of their menstrual cycle. And again, like as you just mentioned, it's probably something in between where each individual woman should be able to identify where they are in their cycle and then be able to put in certain different, things in place for how they feel personally. What would your recommendation be around training, I guess, to your cycle at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen this big switch because there's a couple of voices and research groups that have done systematic reviews, but there's a very, very small amount of research that's been done in the sports science world. So this is where they're like, there's no evidence, but we have to really take that step back where just because there's no evidence doesn't mean that there is a lack of efficacy in what we should be doing. The other thing with the systematic reviews and the voices that are saying menstrual cycle doesn't matter is that they're not taking the lived experience into account. And we see that we need to do mixed methods. And that's why I'm saying we have to look somewhere in the middle. Because if you are to go up to a woman and tell her that her menstrual cycle doesn't account, it doesn't change anything, then you're going to have a direct, oh, well, yes, it does. Because there are some days where I feel great. And there's some days where I feel like shit. So I can't do hard training on the days where I don't feel optimal. And that's what we want to leverage. We want women to understand their own cycle and the days that they feel great versus the days they don't feel so great. So that when it comes down to really getting performance attributes and increasing training load, we're doing on the days where her body is the most resilient to stress, not on the days where she's not so resilient to stress. We also have to overlay things like the immune system, because we see that, in the follicular phase, we have a more robust immune system. We're more capable of fighting off virus and bacteria, and we have a greater capability of taking on stress. But after ovulation, providing the woman does ovulate, we have a change in the immune system where it's more pro-inflammatory. And so this is where we're starting to see more uptick of injuries and soft tissue damage and that kind of stuff. So if we're understanding, is a woman ovulating or not, and understanding the immune system, then we can overlay that on her own perception of her cycle to really nail down training and how it should work for that woman.
When we work as clinicians, I mean, we're always giving some form of rehab and exercise, for the injury episode and usually thereafter. Do you think there's any value in clinicians to speak about this with people to then tailor their rehab and then training after to that?
Yeah, one of my PhD students who just graduated in November, her whole thing was looking at menstrual cycle phase-based rehab for ACL. And we found that those women who were tracking their cycle and did most of the heavy rehab in the follicular phase ended up with better strength and muscle cross-sectional area than those who did traditional research. Now, the thing with the New Zealand rehab proficiency with ACL is that there's a standard pathway of care that's been rolled out to all the physios. And the guy who wrote that was her other supervisor. So the two, I guess, programs are so controlled and the attrition rate was so great that it was like really interesting to see how on board women got when they're like, oh, this is tailored for me as a woman. So I think that had a really big effect on why women's outcomes were better when they were doing follicular based heavy rehab versus across the board, because now they had that this is built for me based on my cycle and my perception. So I'm really motivated to do it. So that's why, like, you can't look from just that physiological perspective when you understand that women respond better to things that right now have been tailored for them as a woman, as their physiology, because people have been excluded for so long. As a clinician, just having that conversation. So you could say, hey, you know what? I know that menstrual cycle or oral contraceptive pill or hormonal contraception can affect how you're feeling and the uptake of rehab. So maybe we should talk about, do you track? How do you feel? What are some of the, signs and symptoms? Are you that motivated? Because the goal of rehab is to get people to do it, right? And to keep them consistent to get that change. So I think just bringing in that extra gendered conversation is going to be beneficial for clinicians.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that was a standard it would make such a difference. Now, I know for all the males listening to this, and I say this every single time, it's always more difficult as a male, I think, or maybe it's just perceived difficulty. But I remember in my first years as a clinician, I didn't ask anything around menstrual cycle and realizing the importance of red S and bone stress injuries. But from when I'm reading it and listening to people like yourself, it may be even more appropriate just in general rehab as well, not just specifically if someone has red S or a bone stress injury. And I like that way to ask it and say, and I guess, would your advice be to say, do you feel different during certain parts of your menstrual cycle? Because potentially we may be able to tailor your rehab and then therefore your resistance training to that. Do you think that's the best way to ask it and bring it up?
Yeah, and the other thing is because the conversation between a male clinician and a younger female might be really difficult, we often pose it as just a standard healthcare question. We do
Mm.
this in young sports teams as well. Like someone comes in, they're coaching high school students, and it's just one of those questions you ask for practice readiness. So if you're in a clinical environment and you're looking for rehabilitation, it becomes just one of those readiness for reparation type things, like where are you in your menstrual cycle? Do you have a normal menstrual cycle? Or, somehow weaving it into just those general questions. And then that opens up the conversation, because then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait, this guy's talking about a menstrual cycle. Oh, okay. And then you start opening up that conversation. And then you could say, hey, here's this other thing that we know, that if you feel better on certain days, you're going to push harder. And the goal of rehabilitation is to put a certain amount of stress on for your body to overcome that stress to get fitter. So maybe we can look at on the days that you feel really fantastic during your cycle to push, and let's try to figure that out. So it's a ways of opening up that conversation instead of, because I know it can be very uncomfortable for people just to launch in.
Yes, I bumbled my way the very first time I asked it. I got it out, but it was horrible. It was very awkward, but you do actually get better over time.
Yeah.
What's your first point of call for someone if they say that they don't and they've never spoken to anyone about it and they're a young athlete or someone in their 20s and 30s?
That they've never talked to anybody about their menstrual cycle at all.
Yeah, and they haven't had one for a long time, and they have a history of injury, or maybe you're
Mhm.
just struggling with energy. What would be your advice, and how would you kind of, I guess, address that with someone?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, there is still that prevailing theory that if you don't get a menstrual cycle and you're amenorrheic, then that's great. You're training hard enough and you're going to perform well. But if they're coming to see you and they're always injured, then you could say, hey, you know what? We need to really look at what we're calling RED-S, or relative energy deficiency in sport. You guys are very aware of what it is, but we're seeing a lot of misstep in the education. There's some healthcare providers who actually don't know what it is. And there's a lot of younger female athletes who don't know what it is. They don't know that one of the first signs is either not getting or having irregular and then missed periods. So if they say, oh, I've never had one, I've never really tracked, then you could say, well, coupled with all the injuries that you're seeing or coming to see me about, maybe we should have a conversation, or have you heard of low energy availability? So you can open up that conversation, and then you can refer out to someone or see if they're taking that on board. If they're not taking it on board, then, you can kind of poke the bear every time they come to see you about, hey, did you eat? What's going on here? So it's just another, kind of rabbit warrant that you have to do as a clinician.
We touched on ACL tears just previously. What is there much robust evidence at the moment to suggest that there's different phases of the cycle that are going to increase someone's risk at an injury like an ACL tear?
So when we're looking at some of the earlier research that is saying, hey, around ovulation, we're seeing a greater increase in ACL injury. And then we have a lot of lab-based work that looks at estrogen creating more elasticity in the tendons. When we have an overview look of it, it's training load and training stress. So it isn't necessarily phase-based or any particular point within the phases that people are having ACL injury. It's the fact that they're asked about it. So where were you in your cycle when this happened? And people will be like, oh, well, I think I was about 5 days or 6 days after my period or before my period, right? So they're associating it with a specific phase. But when it comes down to it, it's training load and training stress. When someone gets to that one point of where they're right before injury, that's generally what's happening. So when we start pulling apart the research, there really isn't any true robust research to show that it's an ovulatory risk factor
Mm.
or a late luteal risk factor. It has to do with that stress resilience.
And then follow up from that is there's some teams that have been encouraging women to go onto the OCP as a way to prevent these injuries. What do you have to say to that?
I get so frustrated when I hear that, because the study that did that was what we call Pearl Diver. So what they did is they went in and did a whole bunch of bootstrapping on epidemiological research to come up with, hey, look, women on OCs didn't have as great ACL injury, but they don't actually know if that's true or not. So it came out in a study because they were just doing a deep dive in a database, but you don't know who actually if they reported they had an injury or not, if they had an ACL tear or not. When we look at how an OC can moderate different things within the body, they're experimental in their own right. And it's not necessarily the estradiol component we're worried about, it's the progestin component. And there's so many different generations of progestin, and each generation has a different effect on tissue and tissue management. And the other big fear about just blanket saying, hey, you should be on an OC is then, of course, it hides any kind of early evidence of low energy availability. So I think there's other things that we can do to prevent ACL, more about the training load monitoring and the stress load monitoring, because I think a lot of people forget that the mental stress of trying to be an athlete in the current sporting environment has a big deal on the physicality and the physical stress, but they tend to be removed from each other. But they have to be brought together because that is a significant injury risk as well.
And even the study that you mentioned before that sort of identified that there's not really a particular phase that an ACL is going to be more likely to happen anyways. It almost makes it hard to understand why that would help in it anyways. Like there's not a hormonal phase that's going to increase someone's risk. So then why are we getting rid of them altogether?
Right. Exactly.
What changes do we see in soft tissue across the phases, like in regards to tendons and ligaments and muscles? And something that I see clinically quite a lot is someone post-menopause develop a condition like plantar heel pain, plantar fasciitis, and the research would suggest that cohort is most likely, and to be female, is most likely to sustain that injury. And it seems as though there is something happening within the body that potentially reduces the capacity of those tissues to handle tensile and compressive loads. So is there anything that's happening on a soft tissue level that we see change and of course over time?
And frozen shoulders would be the other common one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the two biggest injuries in late peri, early postmenopause is frozen shoulder and plantar fascia issues. And excuse me, that does have to do with estradiol. So when we're looking at that early to late 40 onward female athlete, when they're in perimenopause, you're having a change in the ratio of estrogen progesterone, and you're also having a change in particularly the estrogen receptor alpha. So there is a downregulation of that. It's becoming less and less sensitive. So how that affects soft tissue is we have less of an impetus for lean mass development, and we're also having a change in the tensile strength of our ligaments. So we're having a misstep in the reading of actual mechanical stress and how the body can handle that stress. We also see an uptick in inflammation because estrogen dampens inflammation. So if you get some kind of small soft tissue tear or the beginning of a soft tissue injury, inflammation isn't checked by estradiol, so it can go rampant. And this is why we see a lot of those soft tissue injuries that keep popping up in late peri, early postmenopause. And then this is why people are like, oh yeah, estrogen's protective against soft tissue injuries. It's not that estradiol itself is protective. It's the receptor upregulation or downregulation. And so when we're starting to get into peri and postmenopause and we're having a change in receptor sensitivity and the actual amount of expression, that's when you start having the misstep in the feedback of mechanical load and the ability to withstand it. It's not the absolute amount of estradiol that's circulating.
That's so interesting.
Sorry, Blake. Then, so from like a clinician's perspective, is rehab and I guess traditional methods of management going to be helpful in this cohort, or is it something that needs to be almost referred earlier on to a GP or like an endocrinologist or something like that to help with the hormonal side of things?
So we're looking at the hormonal side of things. We often talk about like menopause hormone therapy or looking down that track to help. The issue, again, isn't the absolute amount of hormones that are circulating. It's the change in the receptors and the density and the expression of the receptors. When we look at menopause hormone therapy and the estradiol component, it's still not the same as endogenous estrogen. As much as people say, hey, it's body identical, it's still not the same. It doesn't activate the receptors the same way. It'll slow the rate of change of things, but it doesn't stop. And it also doesn't really help with soft tissue injury. We see a decrease in pain. We see a decrease in inflammation, especially around joints and stuff, but it doesn't actually change the mechanical changes that have happened with the down regulation of these receptors. What we do find in peri and postmenopausal women are things like shockwave therapy, where you're inducing a little bit. Yeah.
We do that. Yeah, we do that quite a lot. And they respond really well. And the research would suggest that as well. That's so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's because it's a mechanical load that is creating an adaptive response where what the hormones used to do. So it's the same as when we talk about exercise and exercise training, doing really polarized work for peri and postmenopausal women, like doing the top end, high intensity work to create epigenetic change. It's the same as when you're doing something like shockwave and you're creating that really strong external response that then the body's like, I got to overcome this. I got to repair. And so it stimulates reparation without estrogen having to be part of that picture.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And at the moment, there's been two really good big reviews come out on Plenty Hill Pain. But again, it's so broad, and Shockwave generally recommended kind of secondary or third line treatment. But again, it hasn't been subcategorized into 20 to 30-year-old males and females, peri-postmenopausal. So it would be interesting to see if that's more effective in that age bracket, because clinically, which I know is a low form of evidence, it definitely seems to be they have a really good, like a hyper response.
And I mean, like in the circles that I talk to and stuff, and they're always getting injured. I'm like, shockwave. And so many women who are 40 plus respond so well to it. So, instead of having a year of plantar pain, it's that 3 month of treatments where they're really they get on top of it. And then they're like, great, I can start to return to run safely, but I have to look at my mechanics. Also gives the opportunity to look at the change in the mechanics when someone gets injured and they go through it. Then you're like, well, what was the precedent? Not only is it perimenopause, but also you're having changes in mechanics because you're having changes in tissue. So we start looking at running form, running economy. We know that we are getting less powerful. We have less fast twitch. So of course our economy is different. So our foot strike is different. So we start looking at those mechanics as well. Then people stop getting as injured, or they stop getting injured full stop.
It's so interesting to hear you say these things, though. I'm just trying to think the last time I read your book was probably maybe 18 months ago. I actually read it and also listened to it, and I will never forget this line you were talking about these changes that are happening in the body and females and women going to the doctor and just kind of in the past and probably still now just getting pushed aside like, hey, that's just women's problems. You just kind of deal with that yourself, and I don't really know anything about it. So it's so interesting to hear this really good advice that people can take and implement that's had such good practical application.
Long may it continue. We like practical aspects.
Can you explain on a physiological level how making changes to our training can have a positive influence on those common menopausal symptoms like hot flashes and insomnia and some of those cognitive changes, those sorts of things?
Yeah. So when we start looking at what the typical 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity does, if you don't move at all, yeah, that's a good recommendation. But when we're really trying to instigate change to attenuate menopausal symptoms, attenuate body composition change, again, as I was saying earlier, we have to look for an external stress that is going to cause an adaptive response the way hormones used to. So if we look at lean mass specifically, we know that we have estrogen receptors that are responsible for how strong myosin bonds with actin. We see that it's responsible for how much acetylcholine is held in the vesicles for the gap junction. And it's also, we see a lot of the estrogen receptor alphas in the muscle cell itself, which stimulates muscle protein development. So when we start to lose estrogen or we have a change in the amount of circulating estradiol, we're losing power, we're losing speed, we're losing lean mass. So if we're lifting heavy, and this is, taking from the power-based idea of the 3 to 5, 80% of one rep max or more, we're creating a central nervous system response where now the central nervous system is saying, hey, wait a second, we need to be able to recruit more fibers. So we have to have a faster nerve conduction. We have to be able to stimulate more fibers to bond. So we have to have a very strong bonding capacity for myosin and actin. And then, by the way, we need more lean mass. So we're getting that stimulus again from a different response than what estradiol used to do. When we look at the high intensity work, so we look specifically at sprint interval training, which is that 20 to 30 seconds as hard as you can go, full gas, 100 to 110% with 3 to 4 minutes recovery between each. This creates an epigenetic change within the muscle cell itself, which increases GLUT4 activation. So now you're able to pull more carbohydrate into the muscle, even at rest, without insulin. So it helps with insulin resistance. We also have a greater amount of exerkines that are released. So that feeds forward to kind of telling the visceral fat, we don't need you. Now, the real physiological response for that is when we have such a strong exercise stress from high intensity work, the mitochondria have to step up, because when we lose estrogen and we have more inflammation, we have a misstep in the mitochondria where it stops using free fatty acids. So we have an extra amount of free fatty acids that start circulating, and that goes to the liver, and the liver binds it up and stores it as visceral fat. If we're doing really super high intensity work, so that's that sprint interval training, or we're doing high intensity interval work, which is around that 85 or more % of our max, it creates a change within the mitochondria to make them more metabolically flexible. So yes, now it's like, okay, I can use carbohydrate and these free fatty acids. So this is really how we're having that conversation to stop visceral fat gain. So when we start looking at why we need to do that top end work for women who are perimenopausal, it's to instigate those epigenetic changes through the exercise that estrogen and progesterone used to create within the muscle and the fat tissue. So if we look at moderate intensity work, which is what most people recommend, or you're doing that zone 2 work, it's not a strong stimulus. It's not going to instigate that same response to create metabolic adaptations, to improve insulin sensitivity, to improve blood glucose control, and to reduce visceral fat gain.
And how are you recommending that for someone that hasn't done it previously?
Ever? Yeah.
And on top of that, which is I know, and I struggle with this quite a lot, dealing with lots of tendons and soft tissue, is the idea of someone jumping and hopping, which is what their soft tissues need, not just for this injury, but for life, is really daunting for people. So where do we start with our recommendation? And also, how do you approach that with people from a confidence and fear point of view?
Yeah. So I look at it as any kind of training program. You have to phase people in, right? So it's not like we're going to throw someone in the gym and say, here, you have to start doing this 120 kilo deadlift because we need you to lift heavy. We need to see how they move. We need to see what their confidence is. So it might take 3 or 4 months for people to upskill, or maybe it takes 2 weeks. So again, you have to look at the training history and also the mentality around what this actually means. I think the biggest fear for most women who are 40 plus is jumping. We start to see more incontinence issues, again, because pelvic floor is a muscle. We start to lose muscle tone because of estrogen changes, but also the fear of soft tissue injuries. So we can use band assisted jumps. So, band assisted pogos, those kinds of things, to really get the leverage and learn how to flex a foot or land. We look at doing low depth box jumps. So you might be stepping off the box and learning how to land. There's other ways of increasing the jump capacity. Could be jump rope or trampolining first before you move to actually jump rope or box jumps. And then when we think about the sprint interval stuff, it's not running. people, you can, of course, run, that's fine, but it's any mode that's going to get them to their max in 20 or 30 seconds. Could be battle ropes, could be med ball slams, could be kettlebell swings. It could be a relative thing of walking hard up the stairs because that's going to get them to where they need to be. So it's at fitness level. And the more that they build their fitness and confidence, then it opens up the world to what they can do.
Do you recommend them to do short bouts daily, or do you like to space it, days apart?
Now, that's the interesting question when we're talking about peri and postmenopausal women. So if we're looking at perimenopause, because that's where we have the biggest amount of body composition changes, especially around the 4 to 5 years before that one point in time menopause, we really would like people to do high intensity work 2 to 3 times a week and heavy lifting minimum 3 times a week. We're trying to reduce the body composition change. So we're trying to maintain that lean mass and reduce visceral fat, and also keep gut microbiome diversity, because we're seeing that the more that we are getting close to that menopause state, the less diversity we have, because it has to do with sex hormone metabolism. So if we're doing lifting and high intensity work, that alters the gut microbiome to become more diverse, and also encouraging lots of fruit and veg intake. When we get to early postmenopause, it's kind of the same pattern. But when we get into late postmenopause, so this is 8 years plus past menopause, we need more frequent doses, but less duration. So this is where we'd look at putting in 4 to 5 days of specific sprint interval training, where it might be 10 minutes of various 20 and 30-second sprints, and trying to divide up the resistance training to hit it about 4 times a week. So instead of spending 40 minutes in the gym, you're doing 20. So you're just focusing on one lift each time you go in instead of doing combination, because we're seeing that the further away you are from menopause, the more and more your receptors have kind of turned off or downregulated. So if you have more doses of that external stress, you have better vascular responses. You have more VEGF that comes up, so better endothelial dilation responses. We see better conversations from those myokines and skeletal muscle responses. So it is a journey across the menopausal transition, and the advice changes according to that journey.
And that could have some application for rehab as well. Like if you're seeing someone 60, 65, 70 with these various soft tissue injuries, more frequent and less overall volume may be a better recommendation, and potentially just easier to think about compliance-wise.
Yeah, exactly.
Are these changes predominantly viewed as like those physiological changes, or has there been any like big RCTs that have done where they've looked at implementing some of the heavy resistance training and sprint interval training versus a control where they continue along their steady state aerobic work?
There's been quite a bit of an uptick in that, I'd say in the past 6 years. JAMA published one really cool study looking at your traditional sets and reps using machines in 70-year-old plus versus looking at the relative 1 rep max intensity and doing 5x5. And the women that were just doing the usual resistance training, they did gain some coordination, proprioception, and lean mass, but those that were doing the heavier lifting significantly increased lean mass, bone strength and bone density, as well as proprioception and balance. So when we're looking at the differences, we think about neural pathways, right? So if we're doing 10 reps of something, it's not as strong of a stimulus to invoke new neural pathways as if you're lifting heavy. And we're looking at that neural pathway development. Again, it has to do with brain and brain health, right? So the more neural pathways we are developing, the more we are attenuating cognitive decline and proprioception decline, as well as then putting the load on the muscle and the bone to encourage lean mass development and bone mineral density increases.
Yeah, that's it. There's so many benefits that come from heavy strength training, and Blake and I are such big advocates for it for everyone. But yeah, it's so good. I find personally, one of the challenges that I find in treating a lot of runners is trying to convince runners to do a bit less in the way of steady state and maybe start to incorporate some more of those things.
Yes,
What's
absolutely.
your advice?
I know. Well, I look at it, and because I think we have created enough of a buzz across endurance that people are now starting to say, hey, wait a second, how do I incorporate resistance training? We're seeing more of the popular magazines like Outside Magazine and Triathlete and Runner's World saying, hey, these are the functional movements that you can do. And it's really a page out of like Bulgarian split squats and heavy squats and front squats and doing some pogos. And I'm like, wait, that's rebranding heavy lifting for the endurance world. That's okay. I'll
Yeah.
take it. Because, it's all about how I can stay injury free to keep training. Not only is it training for the physicality, but maybe you have a run group and all your friends are meeting up and you don't want to lose that too. So if we put in the strength training, one of the things that I often have my endurance athletes do, I'm like, you want to get better at hills? This is what we're going to do. We're going to go do really heavy squats, some Bulgarian split squats, and then we're going to go run up a hill, or we're going to go ride up a hill. So we're taking all of that fatigue from the gym work and putting it into your running or your cycling mechanics so that you're going to be able to keep form when you need to, when you're starting to get tired. And they do that a few times. They're like, holy, this works really well. I'm going to keep doing this. So we have to bring it back to that performance angle still. But yeah.
And you mentioned before, so females tend to have better aerobic capacity in comparison to males. So I guess that's a reason for females to not have to spend at maybe as much volume in just the steady state stuff, and they're better off going down that track where they probably are a little bit deficient in comparison to, say, a male. So then could you say to the menopausal woman that they can sacrifice a little bit of that steady state work and still be able to, run their same speed for a half marathon without, or probably better even?
Yeah. And I get so much pushback when I say that, where
Yeah.
I'm like, look, you can drop the volume, put in the strength training and the intensity work. You actually get faster. And people are like, what? No, especially when you start seeing the greatest population of ultra athletes are your 40 plus masters women, because it's long and slow, right? And when you start losing estrogen and progesterone, your body defaults to being long and slow. And so that's why we see this uptick, right? So we see women are really, really good at being endurance. So of course they're going to be more successful in the longer races. But for those who are ultra runners, and you tell them, look, you don't have to spend as much time on your feet. We want to think about quality during the week where we are doing our heavy lifting and we're doing our sprint stuff. And then we look at where do we put time on the feet for your ultra. And you implement, okay, on the weekend, we're doing 2 days where you're not getting a rate of perceived exertion above a 4. So if that means walking up the hill, you're walking up the hill. But we don't want to overstress. We want you to wear a heart rate monitor to keep it low intensity. So that's where they start to get the time on the feet. And then they're finding that, as any training program, the fitter you are in the top end in the strength, the faster you go at the low end. So you really have to, it's proof in the pudding. Is that the old expression that people used to say, where you really have to get them to do stuff to show that their body adapts well, and then they'll buy into it. But it is such a hard mind shift for people, because for so long still it's all about volume to be able to do endurance stuff.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
the men are probably doing volume, but maybe that's just not as relevant in the female space.
No, because coaching is still about 20 years behind the general coaching and coaching methods. So we'll see what happens in 20 years.
So I haven't got long because I'm about 1 minute faster than Kelly at the moment. Actually, she beat me on Tuesday, but she's going to overtake me in 10 years. And I'll be
Nice.
coming second in the marathon. It's
There
funny
you
you
go.
mentioned as you get older, in females, they tend to be able to handle more of that aerobic, because at the moment, there's some discussion around our current Australian marathon record. I think she's is mid 40s, and everyone's speaking about how amazing it is. She's getting older, she's still running these incredible times, and it has the Australian record for the marathon. But what you're suggesting is probably as she's gotten older, she's going to be getting on a physiological level, actually able to handle longer duration, and her body tolerate that better.
And what she has to do is she has to pepper it with more of that high intensity work, and
Mm,
she'll maintain super form. Like Camille Herron, who's an ultra runner, right? She
mm.
finally is like, oh, I need to do strength and not as much volume. I was like, finally, you're listening after having me in your ear for 4 or 5 years. And she did that, and now she's setting records again. It's like, yeah, less volume, more quality means less injury and faster.
I don't
Is
think
this
there could have been
relevant?
a time more where you would have wanted to say, I told you so.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
never
so
said
for
that.
me to shave off that minute that Blake's got on me, is that relevant in premenopausal women as well, do you think, or less so?
No, because we have more oxidative fibers. So spending the time going out for the long, slow stuff, it's not creating greater mitochondrial density. We're already there. What does help women is doing the specific tempo work and the track workouts and that high intensity work coupled with strength. So yes, you will need to be able to spend 3 hours running, but if you're doing all the quality work and then every 2 weeks or so going out for a really cruisy, long, slow run, you're going to get that minute or more.
Watch this space.
Can you give us an example of someone that say in their 20s or 30s that runs 4 to 6 times a week and wants to incorporate some resistance training? How would you kind of fit that into their week? If they, let's say, do some slow jogging and they do 2 harder sessions a week, where would you tell them to put that training in and why?
And also factoring in their menstrual cycle as well.
So many things.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to for the menstrual cycle, understanding the days they feel great and the days they don't. So we'll have the plan scoped on if you feel great, this is what you do. If you don't feel great, then wait till you do. So most women, actually, there's a really high percentage of women who don't talk about it, but do have really severe ovulatory pain. And then there's the other half that feel fantastic. So that's a big contingency right there. It's like, I'm not going to schedule you for a track workout on the day in and around ovulation if you're one of the women that has really severe pain and dysfunction. So when we're looking at running 2 to 3 quality sessions and maybe 2 long sessions in a week, on the long sessions, which are really low intensity, I would preface those with some heavy lifting. So that what I was saying, like do heavy squats and then hill reps or something like that. I would preface not only are we potentiating the muscles by doing heavy lifting, but it's also preparing them for what it's like to run tired. So then you're not having to go out for 2 hours, you're having to go out for 90 minutes. So we're looking at how are we going to maximize the energy systems and the fatigue and the economy of movement. And then for the 3 really quality sessions, I would look at doing 1 or 2 in the morning, 1 at night, especially if it's like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, which tends to happen. Like people will have Tuesday morning track, Wednesday evening tempo, or maybe it's the reverse, and then Thursday morning or Thursday evening something. I'm like, yes, because we want to maximize the recovery. So Tuesday morning track, Wednesday evening tempo, Thursday morning might be hills, and then it's off. And then Saturday, Sunday might be your long stuff. So one of those days you're going to go to the gym and do a heavy lifting session, really working posterior chain, and then a longer session. Then the next day, don't do the long session, just go out for a 30-minute shakeout, because then you end up with 4 really good quality sessions of varying intensity and then 1 soul food kind of recovery. And then you can start again.
I love that. When it comes to, I guess, prescription and having people track, you did mention that you will have people use a heart rate strap, and I did with my very keen eye because I wear one. I see you have a Whoop on, and I love your strap. I've just got the black one. Do you recommend people should track symptoms, how they're feeling pretty much consistently throughout their life, even in their 20s, 30s, post menopause, with something like a Whoop or a Garmin, and then also with their training using things like heart rates? Do you think it does give good metrics, and not so much the number that's important, but the general trend, and then being able to make recommendations based off that?
Yes and no. I feel like we have all become so motivated on relying on wearables, but the algorithms are not right. So I wear Whoop to see how they should be changing some things, like what doesn't work. And we know things like with heart rate variability, it changes across the menstrual cycle. So you have to be aware of that so that you can compare follicular, luteal to luteal instead of across the month, because those trends aren't right. But the algorithm is comparing across the month. So specific for women. If I'm looking at a heart rate monitor, I don't have people use a heart rate monitor for high intensity or quality sessions. because there's a lag time in the way that a heart rate monitor picks it up. The only way that you're going to get accurate reading is if you're using an ECG. So I tell people to use a heart rate monitor to make sure you're keeping it easy, because so many people do the easy part wrong, right? They don't go slow enough or easy enough. So like I get women to say, I don't understand, my heart rate didn't get up for my sprint workout and my short sprint workout. It's like, well, don't pay attention to heart rate. How did you feel? What was your RPE? We want to look at sessional RPE. But yes, it's good to have trends over time. So if it means tracking using a wearable or tracking in like a handheld diary, that's fantastic. Because when you start looking at trends over time, you can get an idea of where your stress points were. Like I can look at stuff and pick out when a team was traveling versus when they're at home training, because of how heart rate variability as well as menstrual cycle changes occur in my female athletes. So trends over time are great.
Mm. And you mentioned, and I wanted to ask this at the very start, you mentioned the changes that we see, between males and females, from birth all the way through adolescent and prepubescent. Do you think some of the programs that we recommend for injury prevention, especially in soccer over here, football over there, need to be kind of gender specific?
I think I call it soccer too. My daughter's a
Yeah,
soccer
okay.
player. Um, I think when we're looking at the functionality of it, when we're looking especially around the puberty mark, we need to look more at the functional movement for girls because of the biomechanical changes that aren't really incorporated in our standard ways that we're coaching, right? So we know that girls are going to become more ungangly because we have faster and longer limb development, but not density. And we don't have the muscle control of it either. So reteaching them how to kick, land, run, jump, that's really, really important. And it also feeds forward to injury prevention. When we're looking at overall injury prevention plans, the warm-ups, right? So, the FIFA warm-up, that is very male dominated because some of the warm-up mechanisms aren't really addressing some of the issues that young girls have. So we have to really kind of look at what we're doing and how we do it.
Mm. And do you see a distribution in regard to injury risk more proximal versus distal? So we were speaking about before, seeing more things like plantar heel pain. Do you see different injuries in people as they change throughout their life, from the hip to the knee to the foot and the ankle? And I guess, do we have any physiological rationale for that?
The biomechanical changes in women are not addressed early on, like in the teen years. Then we see that leads forward to muscle imbalance or inappropriate muscle control. And so then that's why we start seeing chronic repetitive soft tissue injuries on one particular side. If that's addressed, then it kind of keeps things at bay. What we do see is when someone goes on or changes a hormone profile. So you go from naturally cycling to hormonal contraception, we see different injury patterns that occur because now we have a different hormone profile. You go from an OC to an IUD, same thing. So we start to see, because of the uptake of the receptors and the tissue responses to those different hormone profiles. And then, of course, as we get older, we see a lot of joint pain and injury and an onset of severe osteoarthritis in that late early postmenopause. So that is also when we start to see a lot of lower body, hip, knee injuries, twists, back pain, that kind of stuff, because of the loading that's now trying to occur under a compromised joint.
And it's interesting you mentioned around the hormones and inflammation, because as we're starting to see with a lot of conditions, but really specifically for knee osteoarthritis, we used to think it's very much related to, the load going through the joint, but there's these low level of inflammation, high levels of cytokine, all these things happening. And a lot of the training you're recommending is going to reduce that, although it may not reduce the physical load on the knee. It is causing these systemic changes, which generally has a pretty big impact.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially the inflammatory response, right?
Mm.
Because if we're always doing that moderate intensity stuff, you're still loading the knee and creating that mechanical load, but you're not doing anything to address the inflammation. So that's why it's like, look, we got to look at the, as an exercise physiologist, understanding what exercise can do from a medical standpoint and what intensity does to create change within the body is really important.
And now I've got a couple of two listener questions and a final question. So thank you for your time. What do you think I guess previous research was always suggesting that, resistance training is great, but would you say that it's almost like this elixir for longevity and healthy aging, where even if you don't have an injury and you're asymptomatic and you're generally pretty healthy and get through life okay, you probably should be doing some form of resistance training as a curative, although we can't, say with too much truth that if you do this, your risk of injury is basically gone. But would you recommend it as something that people should do throughout all stages of their life?
Absolutely. And I come from a long history of endurance. Like I told you, ran 20 marathons, Force 20. I've done ultra running. I've done Ironman. I've done Xterra. I was a professional bike racer. So all of my main sports have been endurance. I've had strength training throughout the entire thing. Like I started strength training when I was 16 because a friend's brother was a bodybuilder and he got us in the gym. But the more research that comes out about it, it is so imperative. It's like, you can achieve the cardiovascular and metabolic health benefits that cardiovascular work does with strength training, with less time. But not only that, like I am very cognizant of all the cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and stuff, because I keep reading all this research about it and the sex differences and stuff. It helps men and women because we want to create those new neural pathways. We want to create that robustness. But not only that, when we're 80 or 90, we want to be able to live self-sufficiently, where we're carrying our own groceries up the stairs or maybe playing with our grandkids, right? And we need strong bones and strong muscles and the ligament and tendon attachments that go with that strength. So yeah, super important.
Now, I love this listener question because it's something that I definitely struggle with, and I know other clinicians struggle with as well. Seeing someone post or perimenopause with a higher waist girth, and I do remember this from your book as well, talking about BMI versus like visceral fat and waist girth potentially being a better predictor. But people that want to, and patients more so that speak to us about weight loss and wanting to lose weight, it's a common misconception on their part where they expect 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of walking to be the best thing for them. And we know from a calorie expenditure point of view, it doesn't really use that much energy compared to what you could eat and consume nutrition wise. And let's say someone has the nutrition part covered, they're seeing someone for that. What type of training, although it can't be a broad recommendation, what type of training is best for calorie expenditure, and what recommendation can we make as clinicians to help people, I guess, show them the light that potentially walking is good, but there's other things that are probably better off and have way more benefits in the long term?
Training.
Just one word,
answer, yeah. I mean, you look at it as, what is the most metabolically active tissue that we have besides the brain? Is lean mass, right? If you're doing strength training, you're developing more lean mass. You're creating a myriad of responses within that, where we have a huge vesicle for carbohydrate storage, for fatty acid metabolism, but also exokines that are going to tell the body what to do with extra fat, right? So we see people who aren't that comfortable doing high intensity work. They don't want to go for a run. Walking's okay, but only if they have to park somewhere. You get them in the gym and they start strength training and they feel good without the quote pain of cardio. And so they start doing more of it and they start building more lean mass. And maybe the weight on the scale doesn't change, but the body composition completely does. So the more that we can encourage strength training and moving loads with the body as a lifestyle kind of necessity, I feel that the outcome from a population standpoint is going to be one that has less drain on the healthcare system and more positive attributes as, as a human population.
Yeah, and there's so much variability. I mean, with walking, if you have any lull in pain, it's very hard to modify walking because you walk generally one way. Whereas in the gym, you can do lots of things. You can go upper body, different muscle groups. You can really modify it. So it is great. And our final question, which we ask everyone, and I purposely left it off here just to get it on the front of your mind. If you could, this is interesting because you know a lot of people and know a lot of information. If you could interview anyone to have on a podcast and sit down and pick their brain like we have to you today, who would that be and why? And they can be alive or not alive.
For a fun collegial conversation or for a very polarized conversation?
Mate, we'll say both because I like the categories.
I think for a very collegial conversation, I'd like to talk to Amelia Earhart because she was a pioneer, really
Yeah.
pushing the boundaries there. For a very polarized conversation, probably Donald Trump.
It's funny. You're the second person to say that in the last 5 interviews. That's so funny. Yeah.
If I had to stay in my field, I'd probably sit down with Peter Attia.
Yeah. I was thinking of him just before when we spoke about like longevity, and I like his, but I don't think he coined that term, but the health span versus lifespan. Like you want a longer health span to live longer without disability versus, just your age and numbers. But
Yeah.
yeah. That's
So that's
interesting.
3 instead of just 1. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's really good. Now, for people listening, where can they find you? Everything about you will be in our show notes, of course, but from your socials and courses and books and things like that, what is the best place to go?
For like day-to-day stuff and into what's happening, social, Instagram,
Yeah.
Facebook, Dr. Stacy Sims. But for updates on books, courses, master classes, retreats, all that kind of stuff, our website. And I say our because it's a team. It's not just me. So yeah.
Do you have any in-person courses coming up face to face?
Again, this is conference year.
Yeah.
But I was in Sydney at the beginning of March and did a weekend workshop for some guys over there. So yeah, that's in the cards.
Oh, that's close. That's only an hour and a half from us. So we'll have to look out for you next time you're over, hopefully.
I'll let you know.
Yeah, sounds good. Very much. Thank you so much for coming on, Stacey, and I look forward to releasing this out to our lovely listeners.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been super fun. And I was so glad you asked questions I don't normally answer, which is so refreshing and awesome.
Good. We get that quite a lot, so I'm happy to hear that. Just the clinical relevance is great, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Okay, see ya.
Bye.